Well, good morning, everyone. We begin the 75th session of the Jesús, González, Amuchastegui seminar. It is a round number, something like the diamond jubilee of this academic space. So we are very happy. However, we are not only happy with this achievement, but we are happy because this session is verified with the participation of Professor Mihnea Tănăsescu. Dr. Tănăsescu is research professor at the School of Sociology and Anthropology at the Université de Mons in Belgium. Previously, he has held various academic positions at the universities of Saint Louis, Université of Brussels, New School for Social Research in New York, and the University of Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. His main research interests are ecological justice and the rights of nature. Among his diverse works stand out the books Environment, Political Representation, and the Challenge of Rights, Understanding the Right of 2016, Understanding the Rights of Nature, a Critical Introduction, and Ecocene Politics, both of them from 2022. The later work constitutes the immediate reference for today's session. We therefore invite Professor Tănăsescu to speak for as long as he deems appropriate. I will simply point out that it's customary for him to speak about for 45-50 minutes. Professor Carmen Pérez, an international law professor from this house, who in this contest needs no further introduction, will speak in Spanish, as well as will speak also Rafael Vázquez García, a political scientist, a political theorist, a political theorist at the University of Granada, and Digno Montalván, postdoctoral researcher at the Carlos III Universidad de Madrid, and, if I may say so, our specialist in ecology and right of nature. I propose that the comments do not extend beyond 10 minutes, so they so that we can reserve time for the interventions of the remaining participants in the seminar. Finally, as a last point of order, I would like to point out that Professor Tănăsescu's intervention will be conducted in English as a guide to the intervention of the discussants. However, he is absolutely very fluent in Spanish, as well as in other languages. So if anyone would like to make comments or ask questions, there is no problem with that, and he or she can formulate them in Spanish. Well, without further ado, we'll start the session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for participating in our seminar. So I give the floor to Professor Tănăsescu. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. And I've never been to this campus. I think it's wonderful, especially because there's so much light, which in Belgium we lack quite profoundly. And I want to reiterate that everybody should feel free to speak the language that does most justice to their thoughts. Okay, because that's the important part. So when Digno very kindly invited me here, he gave me the freedom to choose my topic. And freedom is sometimes hard because you have to make choices. So I hope that what I decided to do today is of interest to everyone. But what I decided to do is to comment on a couple of elements from Ecocene Politics, from my book, that in discussions of it so far DJ moment. In discussions of it so far, keep coming back, right? And things that I've had a lot of as questions, or things that I didn't necessarily consider to be central when I wrote the book, but that turned out to be of more general interest. So I'll talk about those elements or central threads, and there's 3 of them, and then set them in a wider context of the arguments in the book that touch upon other things. And just as a recap, the 3 different threads are the idea of hope or hopelessness in environmental matters, the issue of the scale of thinking the environment, whether the planetary level or the local level, and the practice of ecological restoration. And we'll see how those are connected. So the opening sentence of the book is, "The tragedy has already happened," right? Which has a stylistic reason. I think it's good to start by attracting. But beyond that, it has a substantive reason. And the reason is that I think in environmental thought in general, it's time to start from the facts. And the facts as I see them is that we are entering an era of loss, of environmental decomposition and degradation, which to some extent is no longer reversible. It's basically a matter of degrees, and I argue that no human society can therefore count on the future of a particular environment that is deemed optimal or preferable or respecting a historical baseline. So if we start from the facts, then the question is, what stance do we have? What do we allow these facts to do to our own way of understanding the world? And I argue that hope is not the best way or not the only way of psychologically and epistemically dealing with the facts, and instead argue for a stance of lucidity, which I'll develop in a bit. So hope in some way has become an obligatory passage in environmental thought, right? We need to be hopeful, otherwise we go into despair. There's this duality, and I see that often with my students as well, where there's a real sort of psychological centering around this duality of hope and despair. So I want to dwell on this a little bit and explain my position. Now, to be clear, on a sort of everyday level, there's nothing wrong with hope. We use it all the time. As a matter of fact, I take a very Wittgensteinian position on this, where you can't argue with the language game. It's absurd. You know? So I hope that tomorrow will be good weather. is not saying anything more profound than that, right? And I think to be nitpicky about, well, do you actually expect it to, you know, it's, again, I take a Wittgensteinian position. I think that's not very fruitful. So that's not what I mean when I say that I take issue with this concept. I mean the concept as an ideological stance, okay? And what I want to do is unpack the concept of hope as an obligatory passage, as something that one has to have allegiance to, otherwise it leads to despair. But in order I need to set up that discussion before I come back to it in a wider context of the book that explains its title, Ecocene Politics. And the question there is, what era have we entered, okay? And is it justified to speak of a new era? That's also a question. And usually the era that we have entered is described as the Anthropocene. You all know that. I don't necessarily need to dwell on it too much. But it's really interesting. I was just reading the other day, on the 1st of February, the International Union of Geological Sciences had yet a new vote. It was in Spain, no?
Yeah.
a new vote in the Commission on Stratigraphy on whether the Anthropocene is to be declared a new era. And they voted against it, and members of the Anthropocene Working Group were, contesting this decision, saying that it wasn't lawful. And Latour talks about this in some of his work. It's amazing that the International Union of Geological Sciences has become a vital political scene, right, for defining the kind of era we live in. And they voted against calling it the Anthropocene, but not because humans are not impacting the environment, but because they say, so far we can only characterize it as a geological event and not an era. Again, so we're mixing sort of high-level politics with geological technicalities, right, of the difference between an era and an event. And please don't ask me that in the questions, because I don't have those technicalities, right? And that in itself as a situation is really, really fertile ground for thinking environmental issues. But coming back. So the Anthropocene, I argue, is a very good geological concept, okay? And this is the arena where these kinds of contestations are happening, and it's very good because it describes things at the level of analysis that make sense geologically, okay? So basically stratigraphy, which is a study of the deposit of material over time on the crust of the Earth, will indeed register human activity as a very important, maybe dominant one, from, say, my preferred date, the 1945 onward, okay? That is true. The question is whether it's a political term that is helpful or the most helpful. And there you may also know that there's been a lot of critiques of the Anthropocene and other proposals like the Capitalocene or the Plantationocene or an unpronounceable word by Donna Haraway. And all say, well, the problem is that the anthropos, the human, cannot be seen as universally responsible for something that is in fact driven by social and economic inequality. Not everybody has contributed the same way, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all very valid critiques. Instead, what I wanted to propose in all of this is say, well, actually, let's stand on our heads a little bit. And instead of looking at whatever human activity, whereas the anthropos, capitalism, colonialism, whatever may be the case, acting on nature, let's look at it the other way around. And in fact, notice that it's the development of environmental processes themselves that are becoming one of the main drivers of social and political change. Right? So in that sense, the humans are mostly ignorantly poking, but they're not driving the processes of change that they've set in motion. And in that sense, you can say, well, maybe we have entered the era of ecology, the era where ecological processes are dominant over political and social processes, and hence the Ecocene. Now, it's the only made-up word in the whole book, and I apologize for it because I don't necessarily like made-up words. I think it's nicer to retool existing ones. But there you have it, the ecological age. Now, part of the benefit of framing it that way to me is that it allows us to be precise about what ecology means in a political sense, which is also something that is often lacking from environmental thought, which uses the word ecology as some sort of keyword in a Horizon grant application. You have to have, right, the ecology in there, the environment. But really, what is it? What is it that ecology brings to social and political thought that would otherwise be absent? Now, I want to go back to the etymology of ecology. We start, which is the science, the study of the oikos, which in Greek means the home, right? The abode. And the home is where creatures make a life, right? So, ecology on this level is what I would call a small science, and I mean that positively, a small science of interrelations studying what relationships in particular places, ecology is not a global science, right? What relationships in particular places are decisive for habitation, for making something habitable, homely for any particular creature. And I argue that there's three different elements that are really fundamental for how ecology defines or understands or studies the homemaking. The first one is that interrelations at that level are often subject to chance. So whatever models we have to model a particular situation will prove insufficient, mostly because of chance events. Right? Things happen, and Isabel Stengers calls the current ecological era the eruption of Gaia. Right? An eruption is something that happens like a volcano, unannounced, unpredictable, and shows, in a way, the inherent vitality of the world that we will never be able to encompass, because it is it allows for chance. The other thing is change. Change is constant, right? And this is something that we often forget when we sort of are nostalgic for an era like the Holocene, right, which came before the Anthropocene, where we think that things were stable. But things were on average stable, but in every particular situation, change is a norm. And lastly, ecology focuses on localities. Right? The idea that ecology studies interrelations in general, I think, is a dubious popularization of ecology, because ecology is always rooted in some place. It defines some creature in interaction with another creature, and so on and so forth. So this is the setup, okay? So let's come back to hope. If we define the era we have entered, I don't use era in a technical geological sense, don't take me to task with that, as the era of ecology, and therefore where chance, change, and locality become important ideas for thinking what it means to have an ecocene politics. So what meaning can hope have in this context? And I take several issues with that. First, I think it encourages a dualistic habit of mind, okay? Hope versus despair. The problem with that is that despair is guaranteed, okay? And this pendulum between hope and despair is guaranteed to also pass to the despair because of chance and change. Because we can't control outcomes to the extent that we would like, and that goes with a hopeful projection, and also because there's no end. There's no point at which we would have reached, right, an optimal state, as it were. So, in other words, because of ecological processes, ecological politics, in my view, cannot be utopian. There is no ecological utopia, because it has to be in some sense small, like ecology is a small science. It has to be able to take account of constant uncertainty. So the alternative to me is the idea of lucidity, which is a way of sticking with the facts. And here I take guidance from American pragmatism and William James, that talks about how new facts in the world require the modification of previous thought. And the more these new facts accord with what we already know, the more readily they will be accepted, right? But sometimes you have facts that, in order to be accepted, require a wholesale modification of your thought, and those are usually much more resisted, they take more time, etc., etc. But that doesn't make them any more effective in the long run over changing our mind. So in a way, lucidity is a stubbornness of sticking with the facts and trying to live well with uncertainty. Now, one of the objections, of course, is that, well, hope, and Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone have a book called Active Hope, where basically the argument is that hope is a vital psychological and epistemic resource, right? Can people live without it, as it were? And again, I take a Jamesian view. If it's a vital psychological and epistemic resource for you, by all means, go ahead. There's nothing wrong there. My point is that surely that can't be the universal or only attitude or orientation towards an ecocene. Now, lastly, I don't know if I'm saying anything that the Stoics didn't already say. And I think Stoicism is also a vital psychological and epistemic resource in our time. In other words, the tragedy that has already happened doesn't need to be an automatic reason for despair, but may require a kind of fortitude that environmental thought has not been particularly preoccupied with. You could say, well, this is a kind of passivity, right? Well, again, I think the Stoics offer a good example. I think the stubbornness of sticking with the facts and with lucidity, the stubbornness of not hoping, is in a way of doing what you think can't work. Not because of what it will mean tomorrow, but because of what it means today. Because it defines a way to live. And to make this concrete, one of the things I keep thinking about, I'm from Romania originally, and my whole family lived through totalitarian times until they were older than I am now. Okay, so big portion of their life. And in those times, freedom was not a horizon. And yet, people routinely acted as if they could be free. Right? Was it in the hope of freedom? Well, you can put it that way. But it's also to be stubborn, right? To be kind of a fool, because that's how you want to live today. So in a way, hope defers action more, in my opinion, than this form of lucidity does. And finally, I think following this path allows for joy and humor to become part of environmental thinking. Finding and creating delight in the world as a kind of spiritual hygiene for being able to deal with chance and change. I think that's enough on that. So I want to pass to another issue that seems contentious and that has gathered some discussion, namely the issue of scale. And what is the appropriate scale for thinking ecological politics? And there we have another duality. And as you can see, I'm not a big fan of dualities, but let's start there. Between the planetary, the global, the one, the essence, and locality, what I argue as the scale of the ecocene. So I want to reconsider a bit these notions. First of all, with the level of the planet. It's an amazing feat that this idea exists, that we can conceive of the planetary as a scale. And it's something relatively new. Starts with space exploration, basically, and with images of space, and with an incredible, really awe-inspiring scientific effort of connecting so many disciplines and so many sensing apparatus that allow us to understand that there is such a thing as a planet, right? And it's an amazing feat. So what follows as critique is rooted in that awe, in a way, but tries to understand what it means, or what it can mean, or in ecological politics, and arguing that it doesn't come with a sort of automatic interpretation, right? So I'm not denying the fact that it's an amazing thing that we can conceive of the planet. So, but I want to propose a reconsideration of scale itself, what it means to have a scale, to operate at a scale. And this always comes up in environmental politics. Well, it's great that you have your veggie patch, but how do you scale this up? The issue of scalability. How do you scale energy production? How do you scale anything? So I think when we're talking about the planet, the planetary or locality, we can't avoid a more precise understanding of scale, just like we can't avoid a more precise understanding of ecology if we're talking about ecological politics. So one of the most sort of helpful discussions of scale I've come across is in this book by Max Liboiron, a Canadian plastics researcher. He's a biologist studying plastic pollution in cod, in fish. The book is called Pollution is Colonialism. And there she has a very short discussion of scale that then gave me sort of a lead, where she proposes that scale is not a matter of magnitude. Okay, when we think of scale, we immediately think of quantity. Scaling up means making it bigger. Okay, again, like with hope in a regular sense, fine, but that doesn't exhaust the possibilities of the concept. Instead, she proposes that scale is a measure of where things matter and to who. Okay. So the idea of scale as a mapping of meaningfulness at different levels. So in that sense, for instance, the planet is a meaningful concept at COP negotiations, right? Where it's the context in which it immediately matters to participants. For a farmer in southern Spain dealing with drought, the planet is not the immediate level of meaningfulness. Right? That doesn't mean that they're operating at a smaller scale. Right? It means that their scale of meaningfulness is immediate to them in ways where the planet as a concept is not the immediate thing. Right? And in that sense, the planet can be at all sorts of scales. Because it can be on all sorts of scales of meaningfulness. So that's on the side of scale. Now, thinking back on the reconsideration of ecology as a small science of interrelations that makes up a home, the usual interpretation of that is that everything's connected. And therefore, we're immediately again at the level of the global. Well, ecology says everything's connected. A butterfly beats its wings there, a tornado happened in Tokyo, which is, yeah, okay. But so what? Right, is my initial answer to that. So yeah, of course, everything's connected. But a home, what matters to creatures is a limited space. Is always circumscribed. Compared to the vastness of the world, every one of us interacts with a minuscule number of other creatures and processes. Right? Those are the scale, the immediate meaningfulness, the immediate level of relationships. And I also read the idea of Gaia from this perspective, which often has been popularized in a misreading, to my mind, of Lovelock, and particularly of Lynn Margulis, which is given less credit for Gaia, but if anything, she may be more important, as a living organism, the one, the totality. But in fact, what Gaia is, in their work, and in the way particularly Lynn Margulis and Isabel Stengers talk about it, is a contingent systems of patchwork two-way interactions. Okay? And the two-way is between creatures and their environment. Creatures modify their environment as much as the environment modifies creatures. Right? And that's a patchwork process. There is no particular destiny for it. And that's actually its mystery and its beauty. Right? And in that sense, Gaia has had and can have many forms. There's no sort of optimal form of Gaia, as it were, because it's this patchwork of two-way modifications. And in a way, this understanding brings the concept of Gaia down to what Latour calls the critical zone, right? Down to Earth, down to the skin of the Earth, the very thin 12-kilometer tall space of habitability, where things actually matter to creatures. And this also, I believe, is a much more fruitful dialogue with non-Western traditions than the idea of the planet, which has a very clear genealogy in Western science and Western theology. Which brings me to another problem I have with the idea of the totality or the one, and I'm suspicious of it because of the theological roots which moralize it, in fact. So somehow if you don't have allegiance to the one essence, you're not only epistemically wrong, but morally wrong. And I think that's really quite problematic. And its roots in Western science in its reductive form, right? In its quest to reduce things to a one, an essence. So I think the planet flirts with these issues that I've raised as a concept. And I think they're worth examining without throwing the baby with the bathwater, right? And again, I come back to its merits as well. But my overall point is that multiplicity and uncertainty are resources to be safeguarded as opposed to things to be thought away. Okay. Now, the corollary, of course, of the planet is the local. Now, the local also risks fetishism. And we often have this idea of, local communities being inherently good, or, bring it down to the local and then you solve stuff. Well, local is the difficult level, in fact. It's easy to take decisions that are supposed to be overarching, but then when they happen, they never go as you planned, right? It's like, I don't know, you can read parenting books, right, the global, and then you deal with your child and it's like, no, this is not what I read, right? Because the local is unpredictable, again, chance, change, right? So let's not fetishize it. But the local is first and foremost an idea of the site of meaningfulness, the site of relations. Secondly, is not a nativist idea. And this is the fetishism part, where the local is an ethnic category or a nativist category. And I think that's a really dangerous legacy of colonialism that environmentalism has swallowed wholesale without really critiquing it enough. And it also allows us to give rightful importance to the small. And David Graeber, anarchist anthropologist that I love quite a bit, and also James Scott, talk about how the revolutionary, the political side is always with the local, with the incremental, with what happens in the informal. And particularly in the West, we have a tendency to tell history in terms of big men and big monuments, right? And big civilizations. We take tours of cities saying, this is the monument that so-and-so, wow, right? As if that's what drives the process. And Graeber makes the point that, in fact, if you can also look at history and at revolution, right? Not as a complete break, as a jump from monument to monument, but rather as a small process of interrelations, of changes, of resistance, of informality that in time, right, creates also monuments, but also lots of societies that don't have them. And lastly, I think the local allows for a kind of ethics of obligation, which I think is really important as an environmental category, this idea of obligation, which I model on the idea of gift exchange, okay? And for instance, in Maori traditions from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Marcel Mauss wrote about this in the book The Gift, receiving a gift obliges you to its return, but you can never return the same, right? If you give back the same gift, it's an offense, right? Come to my birthday, you give me a gift. Oh, that's great. Here, I gift you this. Right? You're like, what's wrong with you? You're obliged to give back, but you cannot be commensurate.
Exactly.
Which means that a gift obliges you to perpetual return, to perpetual reciprocity, right? And I'll come back to that in a second. So the question then is, what values and practices are congruent with this characterization of an ecocene politics? And I propose two values here. There's other discussions in the book, and one practice. Values are responsibility and reciprocity, and the practice is that of ecological restoration. So responsibility is a dominant value in environmental philosophy, where the idea is that because we've caused so much havoc, we are responsible for nature in one way or another, right? And Hans Jonas has this so development of this idea that we have an infinite responsibility now for future generations because we risk their annihilation, right? And he's thinking about the atomic bomb, but you can think about it as ecological crisis as well. But in fact, responsibility is logically commensurate to capacity, right? You need to be able to be responsible in order to actually be responsible. I can't be responsible for a volcanic eruption because I'm not able to, right? And if you think from ecology, people can, again, wreak all sorts of havoc, but we're not very good at managing natural processes, right? Whenever we try, how do I say that without a swear word? We mess up, okay? So responsibility, for me, is mostly a human concept. The relationship of responsibility, if it's commensurate to capacity, then you can be responsible for what you can be responsible. And these are not ecological processes which are defined by their own logic. On the other hand, an idea that has usually been interpreted as only applying to humans, but that I think is more profoundly applied to environmental relations, is that of reciprocity, right? And I developed that again through Maori philosophy. And the basic idea is that of the ethics of obligation that I was talking about, which involves you in a economy of exchange that makes the world, right? The interrelations of ecology can be described as an infinite series of exchanges. And as a human, you receive lots of gifts of nature, we call them that. That reciprocity and ethics of reciprocity oblige you to return. You cannot do it in a commensurate form, okay? But you must participate in that exchange. Now, of course, in order to do that, you have to become aware and expand the things that matter in your environment. And there's lots of things, I think we're defined by ignorance when it comes to the natural world. But for instance, we now know that gut microbes matter. It's not that they weren't doing their thing before we knew they matter, but now we know. So they can be inscribed in an economy of exchange, in an ethics of obligation or responsibility. I'm running late, so I won't go into the examples there. And this leads me to the practice that I think can incorporate to some way an ethics of obligation, which is that of ecological restoration. And ecological restoration starts its life as a remedy of disaster, of exploitation, which is purely technical, right? So you have a site that has been damaged by mining, for example, and then you have, as a company, an obligation to restore it to its previous state. So it has a baseline, right? You have to return it to X, as if that's possible. It never is, actually. And that's how it starts as a fairly absurd idea, if you ask me. But I think it can have a much more congruent application with what we've been talking about, not as a way of returning to a form or a makeup of a territory, but rather a way of cultivating relations and restoring capacities, restoring human ability to relate meaningfully and to enhance the surrounding world. I often think that one of the achievements of modernity, or what we call the process of modernity, and we can talk about that, what I think that means, is the the redirection of the intelligence of our body, of our basic human sensibility, away from ecological processes and towards purely human ones. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about crossing a street while you're having a conversation on the phone, okay, and thinking about what you have to do tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
the amount of bodily intelligence that is required for you to be able to do that is mind-boggling. Right? Now, the same kind, that you can't turn that off. If you are an embodied creature, that's just how it is. Intelligence is diffused throughout the living world. What modernity does is that it takes that capacity of sensibility away from understanding the natural world, right? What phase of the moon are we in right now? Anybody? Right. I don't know. There you go. You can look it up. Or, what's the history of the vegetation on this campus? When it rains, where does the water go? Et cetera, right? We don't know any of that. But we can recognize the difference between two buildings that are, for probably a crow, identical, right? Without even thinking about it. So it's not that modernity has turned that off. It's usually like, whoa, it's made us blind, it's made us stupid. No, you can't. Like, if you're a body, that's how it is to be a body, okay? It's just that we no longer employ that for ecological relationships. And that's why I think restoration can have a much more profound meaning. And through projects of restoration, of environmental restoration, you can also have it completely tied with the restoration of human capacities for ecological meaningfulness. So new capacities and intervention in the environment can always go together, in fact. And there's a couple examples of this. For instance, very short, the first restoration project in the United States is in Madison, Wisconsin, at the University of Madison, where there's a prairie restoration program that was started by Aldo Leopold in the 1930s. Okay? And it's still ongoing. So it's almost 100 years old.
Wow.
And one of the interventions that they do is that they use fire, okay, as a natural process that humans are becoming part of. So they basically set fire to the prairie every year, okay, which is something that Native Americans used to do, and that the science of forestry stopped, which is the leading cause of the mega fires that are happening all over the world, or at least all over the Western world, okay? Now, this activity is also done with volunteers, with people that are interested, with non-specialists, basically. It's not a technical activity. So you can say, well, what's happening there is that they're restoring a particular makeup of particular species because they need fire, et cetera, and that's fine. They're also doing that. But what I argue they're also doing is teaching people that fire matters, right? That fire is a way of relating to the world in a way that enhances that environment and that makes you part of it in a way that's much more meaningful than just thinking about species composition. In New York City, there is the Bronx River. Anybody know there's a Bronx River? It was a surprise to me as well. And amazingly, it was a surprise to many residents when a project called the Bronx River Restoration Project was started, okay? So there was people that lived, half a kilometer from the Bronx River and didn't know there was a river in their neighborhood.
Wow.
Because it was a site of extreme pollution, of social environmental exclusion, environmental justice. Richard can go wild on this, okay? It's a classic case of environmental injustice. And in the 70s already, there was a community of a group of citizens that started a cleanup project of the river. And nowadays, there's the Bronx River Alliance, which reunites 70 different organizations from grassroots all the way to state government, okay? So again, where things matter are on different scales there. And it's a comprehensive project of education. They work with schools and of basically community building through a kind of ritualized activity with the river. And what I call ritualized activity, for instance, is going on canoe trips. Okay, you can say, well, they're just going to paddle. But when you go on a canoe trip, you have to understand the way the water moves. You have to understand what floating is, right? You have to dress a certain way. You have to be there at a certain time, etc., etc. These are all elements that are common with other kinds of rituals and that create a sort of meaningfulness, a sort of relationship with the river, which is just as much part of a restoration project. Okay? And I can go on talking about this example. And I don't mean that these are, blueprints, but they offer a kind of different structures that can be populated in specific places. What I called in the book at some point infrastructures of reciprocity. Right? And this can be legal as well. There can be legal infrastructures that allow for this. So there's a new EU restoration law, for instance, which I'm yet to thoroughly read, but a priori there's no reason why a restoration law cannot be pushed in this kind of direction. So I think there's a real practical implication here. And in that sense, restoration also becomes the creation of that which we have not yet imagined, as opposed to just saving what we know. And the way of, I think, part of its most important meaning is reversing the very modernist idea that people are inherently bad for nature, and instead showing ways, pathways, infrastructures through which people can actually be good for their immediate environment. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Tănăsescu. Now it's el turno de la profesora Carmen Pérez. 10 minutos.
Sí, thank you very much for your intervention. También quiero agradecer al grupo de investigación sobre el derecho a la justicia la invitación para el micrófono. Para la invitación para estar hoy aquí, y a Digno, que sé que ha sido el impulsor del acto, y por supuesto al profesor Tănăsescu, que haya escrito el libro. Enhorabuena por eso y también su presencia hoy aquí. Lo primero que quiero decir es que he disfrutado de la lectura del libro. Yo soy jurista, profesora de Derecho Internacional Público, y esa es seguramente la mirada, ¿no? Desde la que me aproximo a todo, pero es un libro que es intelectualmente estimulante, yo creo, ¿no? Para los que somos juristas, porque obliga a replantearse algunos de los planteamientos o de los cimientos que nos han formado, ¿no? Digamos, como juristas, como internacionalistas en mi caso, ¿no? Yo creo que hay una diferencia, me referiré a ello más tarde. El libro se centra en lo político, evidentemente, no en lo jurídico, lo político entendido como el proceso, digamos, de quién decide qué hacer sobre asuntos que son de un interés, ¿no?, compartido. Y entre esas cosas, entre esos intereses está, y es la que a mí me interesa quizás, ¿no?, por algunas preocupaciones que tenemos en el grupo, últimamente me voy a referir a eso también, cómo lograr una gobernanza ambiental global efectiva, ¿no? Eso es, digamos, una de las preocupaciones, y qué puede aportar lo ecológico, la ecología, el pensamiento desde la ecología a ese propósito. Y yo cuando leo el libro pienso, ¿y qué puede aportar todo esto a lo jurídico, ¿no?, a lo legal, o lo que a mí me preocupa, cómo resolver mediante el derecho o a través del derecho internacional, qué diálogo sugiere, quiero decir, ¿no?, con lo jurídico. Y, como decía antes, tiene una conexión directa con algunos debates que estamos teniendo en el grupo de investigación, en el GIDIC, y en particular yo he visto una conexión, me ha interesado la conexión con la idea de ecologizar el derecho internacional. Esa idea que es uno de los proyectos, ¿no?, que tenemos en ciernes, pensar sobre eso. Y en concreto en dos aspectos. ¿Qué comparte la reflexión que propone el libro con esa idea de ecologización del derecho internacional? Yo creo que hay una similitud de planteamiento en el enfoque, digamos, ¿no?, desde el que se piensa el problema, en un caso políticamente y en el otro caso jurídicamente o legalmente. Porque al igual que el término ecoceno se centra en lo que la ecología puede aportar al pensamiento político, ¿no?, o a la teoría política, frente a ese término antropoceno que ya el autor ha dicho, lo ha dicho en el libro, que tiene un sentido quizás más sentido en el ámbito de la geología que de la ciencia política, porque concibe al ser humano como una fuerza geológica, ¿no? Y pues hacer ecológico el derecho internacional implica también proponer un derecho internacional que sea coherente con la realidad ecológica de la vida en la Tierra, y se debería traducir en la adopción de reglas, de estructuras de gobernanza, pero también de soluciones y de medidas concretas que reconozcan los intereses ecológicos como valores de la comunidad internacional, entendida como comunidad jurídica, no solo como comunidad política, como comunidad jurídica. ¿Cómo traducimos lo ecológico jurídicamente, digamos? Claro, por supuesto asumimos, pero yo creo que eso el autor no lo discute, aunque se ocupe poco de lo jurídico, pone ejemplos. O sea, el derecho es insuficiente, el derecho internacional lo es imperfecto, pero es la respuesta que nos hemos dado, ¿no? Para, digamos, afrontar problemas, lo que tiene que ver con la crisis ecológica, problemas globales. No ponemos eso en duda, por lo tanto. Necesitamos un derecho internacional que verdaderamente sirva a eso. Y de eso es de lo que va a ecologizar el derecho internacional. Y eso requiere planteamientos en distintos ámbitos, y el punto de partida de la reflexión es dónde están los obstáculos para eso y qué puede aportar el libro en ese sentido. Yo creo que seguramente dos de los obstáculos principales son el antropocentrismo y el estatocentrismo, ¿no? El Estado está en el centro, y eso tiene que ver con la propia estructura de la sociedad internacional, que es una sociedad internacional que desde la paz de Westfalia es estatocéntrica, y no creo que sea una casualidad, o sea, quiero decir, no es una casualidad, evidentemente. Creo que es importante no perder de vista que eso es un presupuesto occidental, porque esa era una sociedad europea que vivía, ¿no? Que se crea, reducida, eurocéntrica, cuando con la paz de Westfalia el Estado surge como, digamos, el actor, ¿no? Una entidad política independiente, y eso se nutre, eso se ha ido expandiendo, pero no ha cambiado fundamentalmente. Y bueno, hay algunos cambios en el derecho internacional, algunos desarrollos incipientes que pretenden superar eso. Bueno, no estoy tan segura. Lo que tiene que ver con el antropocentrismo quizás sí, ¿no? Porque creo que hay algunos desarrollos que hablan de proporcionar personalidad jurídica y por lo tanto convertir en sujetos y no solo en objetos a entidades no humanas. Y usted menciona, el autor menciona algunos ejemplos en la página 141, por ejemplo, ¿no? Cuando se refiere al reconocimiento de la personalidad jurídica al hogar ancestral de los Tuhoe, Te Urewera y el río Wanawee en Nueva Zelanda, y hay otros ejemplos, ¿no? Incluso en España, como el Mar Menor. Bueno, ahí está la ecología forzando, ¿no? A ese cambio de paradigma, ya no son objetos, son sujetos. Seguramente algo ha aprendido el derecho internacional. Pero creo que el estatocentrismo sigue siendo uno de los problemas, ¿no? Bueno, el Estado es el protagonista, en derecho internacional lo es el que hace, digamos, ¿no? El derecho internacional, y entonces se piensa desde paradigmas de estatalidad, de territorio, de soberanía estatal, de jurisdicción estatal. Y eso que yo creo que la crisis climática está poniendo, digamos, o incidiendo, afectando dos de los elementos que definen la estatalidad. Por una parte, la población, ¿no? Porque obliga, no solo porque obliga al desplazamiento forzado de muchas personas en el mundo, es que en algunos casos, y voy a poner el caso de Tuvalu, que Digno se va a reír, pero es que me tiene, ¿no? No sé, ocupada intelectualmente desde hace tiempo, no es solo que toda la población de Tuvalu vaya a tener que ser desplazada del país, porque el país va a desaparecer, y ya se haya firmado con Australia un tratado internacional bilateral que va a permitir, ¿no? Que por etapas el reasentamiento de la totalidad de la población de un Estado por motivos climáticos. Ese tratado, que es muy reciente, de noviembre de 2023. Pero no es solo a la población, que es, insisto, uno de los elementos que definen al Estado, es que es el territorio. Es que el territorio del Estado va a desaparecer. Bueno, ya se da algunos dicen dentro de 50 años, otros dicen dentro de 100 años, pero todo el mundo asume, ¿no? Se ha asumido ya como un hecho que eso va a desaparecer bajo las aguas. ¿Y qué va a pasar con el Estado? ¿Desaparece un sujeto del derecho internacional? Entonces, se han propuesto soluciones como, por ejemplo, crear un gemelo digital, ¿no? Y eso, que parece novedoso, en el fondo no lo es, porque no cuestiona al Estado como sujeto principal del derecho internacional. Hay que conservar la estatalidad, ¿no? O sea, lo que parece muy moderno, porque lo es, ¿no? Replicarse en el metaverso para seguir existiendo, en realidad bebe de las mismas fuentes que en el siglo, ¿no? En 1648 la paz de Westfalia informó lo que sigue siendo la comunidad. Sigue siendo eurocéntrico, por tanto, yo creo. Así que es una oportunidad esto para repensar de verdad distintas formas desde lo ecológico. Yo me quedo en la pregunta, la verdad, porque no sé de ecología, pero me ha sugerido eso, ¿no? De hecho, quiero decirle que hasta que leí el libro pensaba que lo de Tuvalu era de verdad innovador y transformador, y de pronto me di cuenta de que no, de que sigue siendo, ¿no? Y ya para terminar, porque 10 minutos pasan. Una segunda idea que me ha interesado mucho es la de mutualismo, ¿no? Esa que viene, porque si no lo he entendido mal, es una interacción biológica entre individuos de distintas especies, en donde ambos se benefician y mejoran su actitud biológica en principio. Pero claro, esa referencia a la interacción, al beneficio recíproco, es sugerente en el ámbito de las relaciones internacionales. Y aquí lo que tengo en realidad son preguntas, porque vistos los ejemplos, ¿no?, que proporciona en el libro, no estoy muy segura, bueno, tengo que pensar más sobre ello, ¿no?, de dónde puede venir la utilidad en el derecho, para el derecho internacional. Porque claro, él en el libro, la página 167, lo dice, no necesita tener tendencia, el mutualismo no necesita tener tendencias universalistas, se trata de relaciones específicas, las relaciones solo existen en términos específicos, no tiene sentido algo como relacionarse con el mundo, ¿no?, lo dice, o por lo tanto ser beneficioso para el mundo o salvarlo. Y claro, es que el derecho internacional adopta o quiere adoptar en principio una perspectiva para el mundo, desde el mundo y para el mundo, ¿no?, para gobernar lo que es global, lo que es supranacional, no ya local, lo que es, o sea, está por encima de lo que es incluso nacional. Pero de nuevo aquí el libro me ha hecho repensar otra de las características que define el derecho internacional, ¿no?, que es la fragmentación, que se ha visto siempre como un obstáculo y como un problema, y de pronto yo he pensado, no, quizás es, ¿no?, tomando esta idea del localismo, esa fragmentación del derecho internacional es una consecuencia lógica, ¿no?, de la imposibilidad de, seguramente lo que tiene que ver con el clima, adoptar soluciones que sean planetarias, ¿no? Habrá que adaptar las soluciones a los problemas que sean locales o específicos, ¿no?, en ese sentido. Y en realidad esto es lo que quería decir. Quería dar la enhorabuena, 10 minutos, la enhorabuena de nuevo, y estaré encantada de seguir debatiendo más tarde. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted.
Bueno, pues buenos días a todas y a todos. Igualmente gracias a... ¿Se escucha bien, verdad? Sí. Gracias a los organizadores, al seminario, a la universidad, a Digno de forma más concreta por la invitación. Bueno, en la presentación José María decía, sí, más bien teoría política, ¿no? Un teórico político. Yo me sitúo dentro de los critical studies, bueno, pues mi tradición viene un poco desde el pensamiento Green Political Thought, y de ahí pues he ido deviniendo fundamentalmente a cuestiones de antiespecismo y de estudios decoloniales, ¿no? Entonces, a mí me gustaría agradecer fundamentalmente a Mihnea, al profesor Tănăsescu, por el libro. Es un libro que os recomiendo, además está en Open Access, con lo cual podéis leerlo, y eso está bien, ¿no? Es una manera de decolonizar el pensamiento también, ¿no?, que pueda llegar a más gente. Es un libro... me estoy traduciendo ahora de todo lo que iba a decir en inglés, ¿no? Es un libro bastante provocador, muy estimulante, y el que lleva a muchos lugares dentro de la teoría política. Igual que también en el ámbito del derecho. Digamos que hay muchas lecturas de este libro, y vosotras y vosotros podéis hacer la vuestra. Está lleno, además es un libro muy bien planteado, con un diagnosis, con una historia, con unos principios y con unas pautas también para la acción, ¿no? Y algo que él que comentaba, Tănăsescu, el profesor Tănăsescu, es que hay que dejar un poco de lado la esperanza y ceñirnos a actos y actividades y propuestas concretas que pueden pasar por lo local y que pueden tal vez tener una dimensión internacional debidamente también juridificada. A mí me gustaría plantear 3 o 4 ideas muy rápidas para que pudieran ser objeto de un posterior debate si queréis. La primera es, este viernes pasado yo estaba presentando un libro de un colega muy queridísimo, Valentín Clavé, me decía. El libro es del Decolonizing Political Concepts. Ese es el título del libro. También está en Open Access, con lo cual podéis leerlo cuando queráis y lo recomiendo muchísimo. Entonces, en uno de los capítulos del libro, yo hice una especie de review, ¿no? de recensión del libro, pues se hablaba de lo que se llama la white ignorance, la ignorancia blanca. Yo creo que gran parte de los debates que se han puesto aquí encima de la mesa tienen que ver con una idea que puede resultar un tanto casi conceptualmente muy etérea, la idea de ignorancia blanca, pero a mí, vinculándolo con los conceptos que Mihnea planteaba en su libro sobre reciprocidad, vulnerabilidad, mutualismo, multinaturalismo, obligación, es un concepto que en realidad a mí, es mi opinión al menos, nos pone o nos lleva a una base que puede resultar muy digamos, provocadora o al menos conflictiva, que es la cuestión de el presupuesto del contrato, el contrato humano, el contrato que hemos establecido al menos en los 2 o 3 últimos siglos. Hablamos de anthropocene, del antropoceno. ¿Es esto algo que se podía haber previsto antes de la revolución industrial o es algo que realmente tiene sentido a partir de la revolución industrial? Para mí, como profesor y como teórico político, me interesa fundamentalmente anclarnos en la idea de contrato liberal. Yo creo que el contrato liberal, volviendo a la idea, está basado en la deliberada ignorancia blanca. Lo decía Carol Pateman cuando hablaba de sexual contract, ¿no? Decía, está deliberadamente omitiendo los derechos, la igualdad entre hombres y mujeres. Charles Mills decía después de racial contract también, ¿no? Deliberadamente está omitiendo la discriminación, la segregación racial, la esclavitud y la idea, y obviamente asumiendo como universal el supremacismo blanco, pero también con respecto a nuestro entorno, con respecto a lo que podamos denominar el environment o el medio ambiente o el planeta o los nombres que queramos darles, no siendo expertos en biología o en mi caso, no, en antropología, ¿no? Con lo cual creo que ese es un punto interesante que vincula lo que en ese término de white ignorance, de ignorancia blanca, ¿no? Todo está funcionando en base a una asunción que está basada en una deliberada ignorancia blanca. ¿Bien? Este es un punto para el debate que quería traer. El segundo es, el segundo punto es algo que también el profesor Tănăsescu ha comentado, que es cómo actuamos. Y la profesora Carmen Pérez también decía, bueno, vale, podemos actuar a nivel local, pero también llega un momento en el que necesitamos esa necesidad humana, política y jurídica de positivizar un comportamiento más extensible. Bien, porque Tuvalu no es Tuvalu, porque claro, si no tenemos que salir de allí tendremos que ir a otro sitio. Bien, con lo cual ya la situación se expande y no es solamente local. Pero aquí hay un debate interesante sobre si lo local, esto en teoría política, cuando Strong Democracy, este libro de Benjamin Butler decía, la única posibilidad, y David Graeber decía, ¿no? El Estado es la imposibilidad de la democracia, la posibilidad pasa por el no Estado. Bien, el Estado sí es lo que nos impide ser democráticos, con lo cual nuestra forma de actuar debe aterrizar en lo local. Sí, pero lo local tiene enormes peligros esencialistas, que también el profesor Tănăsescu lo comentaba, ¿no? De hecho, muchas de las propuestas más medioambientalistas en los últimos años proceden de la extrema derecha, ¿no? Que algunos llaman ecofascismo, aunque también se llama ecofascismo a lo contrario, ¿no? A posiciones extremas de ecologistas, ¿no? Que podrían ser anarquistas o de izquierdas. Ese término creo que está un poco ahí en el aire. Y por último, para también acotar mi intervención y dejar otro elemento más para el debate, está una cuestión que a mí me interesa mucho, no solamente como teórico, y en eso he dedicado los 3 últimos años, sino como activista antiespecista. Y tiene que ver con el mutualismo, de nuevo, la idea de mutualismo. ¿Hasta qué punto podemos llevar a cabo una interrelación con un entorno que para mí no es un obstáculo, pero que hay quienes proponen que el no logos humano del no entorno es una imposibilidad para el diálogo, para la cooperación, para la reciprocidad, porque estamos en un fuera de lo humano, ¿no? En un fuera de lo humano. ¿Seríamos capaces de actuar, como decíamos algunos compañeros, beyond the human, ¿no? Understanding? Esa sería un poco mi última idea, y de nuevo pues, agradecer a quienes han hecho posible el encuentro, el seminario, y fundamentalmente a Mihnea por un trabajo magnífico y muy estimulante. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, profesor.
Muchísimas gracias, José María, and thank you very much, Professor Mihnea, for your presentation. In order to try to take advantage of the time, I add myself to the congratulations of my colleagues from your book. I have been following your work Science Understanding of the Rights of Nature, your previous book. And this book seems to me like a normal continuity to that book, in the sense of complement at least the proposal that I find were lacking in your previous book, which were more related to the analysis about the rights of nature and the ecocentric proposals. So congratulations for this new book. It has been really interesting for me and for my analysis. So I will articulate my commentary from 4 main questions. The first one is, what is the role of other non-anthropocentric frameworks in the ecocene? And I'm going to explain my question. The second question will be, what is the role of ecological science in the governing of the ecocene? I will explain why I made this question. And what is the role of law in line with the question that Professor Carmen mentioned to you? What is the role of law in the ecocene? And the last one will be, what is the role of individuals in the ecocene? So you talked to us about the hope and the problems related to base and new ethic, ecological new ethic, uniquely in hope, no? And you said in your book, when I'm quoting, when faced with great problems, it is assumed that being hopeful, finding scenarios that fuel the feeling of hope, is what can drive people forward. This book starts from a different assumption, that hope is not necessarily the principle of action it is deemed to be. Hope risks dogmatism, you said. I totally agree with this point of view. In fact, I have heard with astonishment in more than one occasion that fear is the main sentiment on which most green political thought rests. I, however, in most of the recent proposals, have found rather the opposite. I have found theoretical proposals built on extreme hope, utopias that pretend to design new transition models under use naturalistic, techno-optimistic, technocratic, isolationist or imperialistic postulates. I'm thinking, for example, in the use naturalistic assumption behind the Ecozoic era of Thomas Berry in his book The Great Work, or the Wild Law of Cormac Cullinan, in the Empire of the Cyborgs and the Mega Engineer proposed by Lovelock in his latest works, in what he calls the Novacene era. I'm thinking also in the villages of ontological resistance proposed by Arturo Escobar in his book Design for the Pluriverse, a kind of non-Western islands that, from their isolation from the world, from the Western world, could, in the future, through process of structural coupling, which is not clear how it will happen, will form the pluriverse. Or in the supra-state proposed by the Italian jurist Luigi Ferraioli in his most recent book, Constitution of the Earth. All these proposals seem to walk in the opposite direction that to what you propose in your book, Ecocene Politics. However, on page 19 of your book, you mention whether we are thinking about the growing moments for reinstating commons in the theories and practice coming out of indigenous struggle under the banner of the pluriverse, legal movement for extending legal personality to or parts of nature, conservation movements trying to decolonize conservation praxis, All these different ways of articulating worlds share a general principle of mutualism. This is not held dogmatically, but rather grows out of a shared commitment to multiplicity, relationality, reciprocity, and responsibility. End quote. Many of the proposals they have mentioned, although they incorporate relational aspects in their theory, are highly dogmatic. They propose a model of the world under entirely ideal parameters. With this context, my concrete question will be, how do these other non-anthropocentric proposals dialogue with the Ecocene? The second question is, what is the role of ecological science in governing the Ecocene? In your book, you state that ecological science must, and I'm quoting, breaking out of its technical shell. Change, and locality are characteristics of the world that ecology posits, but they are not always the guidelines of the science of ecology itself. There, the temptation to simplify and subsume under immutable principles is as strong as in any other science. This position led me immediately to Latour's work and the idea that there has never been another politics than the one of nature, nor another nature than the one of politics. However, Latour says, in today's ecological movements, science remains a mirror of the world, to the point that in the research, nature and science appears as a kind of synonymous. The ideas of Latour has greatly influenced my own reflections and yours, according to what you said in your book, on the ecological issues, and therefore I can only agree that ecological science tends to rely on immutable principles. However, the alternative that you propose in your book, Ecocene Politics, seems to be different from the Parliament of Things of Latour, for example. While Latour proposed that various actors intervene in the political representation of nature, being only one of them the ecological science, you propose an ecological science with, you propose a different understanding of ecological science. At least that was my understanding. You propose an ecological science with a non-expert approach, with a social and relational approach has a fundamental basis for the Ecocene. You seem to propose an opening of the very meaning of the ecological science. My question in this regard is, such an opening of what will be ecological science will not completely take away its feature of science, and if so, is this not dangerous? Such lack of differentiation between what is proper to ecological science and what is proper, for example, to social dynamics cannot cause us to fall once again into what Latour denounced, the obscuring of the differences between the two disciplines and the capture of politics, again, by science. Also, you have the question of Professor Carmen about what is the role of law in the Ecocene, but I want to frame that question in your debate about the multinaturalism and the incommensurability. So how can we judge incommensurability? So how can we use the law to judge incommensurability? There's, for me, a huge problem coming from the law field. Although I agree with Viveros de Castro studies, it's really difficult to get closer the reflection of the politics of ontology and the question of the law itself, the role of the judges. No. Finally, I want to make a brief comment about what is the role of individuals in the Ecocene. In your book, you propose, in line with Latour, to see Gaia not as a whole system, but as the skin that protects the interrelationship that happen under. This interpretation about Gaia, by the way, completely different to the one that was proposed by Lovelock itself, derive in an ethics that give more importance to relationship than to individuals. In your words, individual creatures are only ever individual in as much as that concept serves a purpose in forming relationship. This reminds me a lot to the use that has been made of another concept also widely employed in ecological debates, which is autopoiesis. Mm-hmm. This term defines living beings as a molecular system that creates, reproduce and maintain themselves. A concept created by biologists, a Chilean biologist, Humberto Maturana, and a mathematician, Varela. As a consequence of this, they say, living systems are necessarily formed through their recurring interaction with each other and with the non-biotic environment, through the conservation of the reciprocal structural couplings. This has led to proposals, the autopoiesis concepts, has led to proposals such as the Luhmann's system theory, or in the law field, Gunther Tebner theory about the law has an autopoietic system, have something that is closed itself and is maintained by relationships only. However, both Maturana and Varela have established that their concept should be used only in the biological sciences, and strongly criticizing its use in the social science. Making a relationship between the debates about the autopoiesis and you propose of giving more importance to the relationship than the individuals, my question would be, wouldn't this could be also dangerous in the sense of being focused on the relationship can avoid the task of the individuals in creating the relationships? When we focus on the relationship, we are focusing on the result. What is the position of individuals in that result in Ecocene Politics? That would be my question. And a final reflection about the intra-specific proposal related to responsibility. You mentioned also there, and I fully agree with this idea, that the intra-specific responsibility doesn't propose type of stewardship or guardianship to the earth, which I find interesting, because when I was working related to, for example, the Trato case, River, and the idea of biocultural rights, one of the most, let's say, astonished things that I read there is the idea of that in order to the indigenous people have a right to their territory, they first must have the duty of care about the territory. And that is crazy for me, because there is an extra burden that you put on their indigenous peoples. The idea that in order to having rights, you first have to be ecological. No? So this idea of the intra-specific responsibility has been has I think connect with that reflection about we shouldn't connect rights with the idea of a care of environment. I think that there are two maybe different fields. So thank you very much. Sorry.
A new book there.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, I can't thank you all enough. I have more notes on your questions than I had for my talk. So, how much time do you have?
Take your time.
Yeah, but I also want to open it up for discussion. So I'll try to go sort of through the different questions and maybe make common answers when it's possible. But I love the fact that you come from different disciplines, and this is something that surprised me in a way, in the way that the book has traveled, is how it has mostly spoken to people that are not in where I'm coming from, right? And also architecture, design, things that I would never expect, law, political theory, and so on. So it's wonderful to have these perspectives, because everybody sees something else, and it's very revelatory. So your first point, Carmen, I think was about ecologizing law, right? And here I love your proposal of, or your analysis of state centrism. I think that's absolutely right. And in a way, you know, one of the questions that came to me for you as an answer is, to what extent do you think that international environmental law can overcome its own basis, right? Because international law is based on states, right? So an overcoming of states by international law would be sort of overcoming its own ground, right? So to what extent would that be a transformation of the international, right, to something else? And here, I think one way in which, you know, there's a growing movement, and you point out some examples of what's called ecological law and eco-jurisprudence. There's an eco-jurisprudence monitor online that you can check for a political and geographical map of different ecological law popping up. And unfortunately, it's been mostly sort of dominated by the rights of nature paradigm. But in fact, to me, what ecological law has as the most profound proposal is legal pluralism, right? It's saying that law can have different sources, and that different sources of law can matter in a more horizontal way. So one way in which I think ecological law and can become sort of a pluralist turn in law is also by a connection with democracy, actually, and with a form of deep democracy, which is often theorized against the state, right? So I think there's also a lead there, right? A certain kind of alliance that can be made. And you know, you mentioned Wanganui River in New Zealand. Well, there, to me, the most amazing part of that act of parliament, that law, is not the rights of nature. In fact, there are no rights. Okay, there's only legal personality. But what there is an extremely detailed, deeply democratic arrangement of how speaking on behalf of the legal person has to be arranged, right? And it forces all sorts of people to the table. It makes it very slow, right? Which flies in the face of sort of the urgency of environmental action, right? The horizon is at least 50 years, right? But that's democracy, right? So I think that there it's interesting how through working through state law, actually, you have you cut out an area of at least partial sovereignty for different groups, including Maori descent groups, that then are formatted in a deeply democratic fashion, right? And I don't know how to go further with that. Right? I put it there as something that your questions sort of activated in me. I also like your idea that fragmentation of international law is a result of the impossibility of dealing with ecological issues globally to some extent. I think that's wonderful. And you ask, what use does mutualism have in international law? And again, I come back to pluralism. I think that there's ways in which, and this answers sort of other questions as well from Digno. So for instance, one of the ideas I've been working on is the idea that, so in international law and in state law as well, you have the idea of previous consultation, right? Previous and informed consent as a established idea, right? And for instance, in the Ecuadorian context, one of the revendications of indigenous groups has been for consent and not consultation, right? And that's a battle that's still ongoing, because the state has an obligation to consult communities when they propose certain actions in their territories, but the communities don't have to consent, right? And also for the Constitutional Court, their ruling on the rights of nature, this has been one basis for challenging environmental permits, for instance, is the basis of they haven't consulted in a proper sense, right? Now, I personally don't see any barrier to having an ecological consultation where you have a multi-species consultation, right? And therefore involving a pluralism of actors and really engaging, again, the democratic question of who can speak for who, under what conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And none of those have pre-given answers, just like indigenous consultation doesn't have pre-given answers. It works differently in different cases, and the judge has to judge and say, well, it worked well here, didn't work well there, right? Or to say, well, it worked for this community, but not for that one. Is that a problem or not, right? Now, I don't see why established concepts like that cannot be sort of subverted in this incremental way by more multi-species openings, right? And that's the thing I'm working on. We can discuss it further if you want. So that, again, that comes to mind as part of your questioning. And Rafael, so the book was called Decolonizing Political Practices?
And decolonizing political concepts.
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 Thanks.
And there are 2 chapters about environment in the book.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, there's some really interesting books that have come out also in French lately on the relationship between environmentalism and colonialism. I'll get you the titles.
Sure.
Some have been translated in English as well. So basically your question, there was 2 as I took them. How do we act, right? Local, fine, but there's also more inclusive ways. And also the anti-speciesism, right? And how to dialogue and reciprocate outside the human. Now, I come back to the idea of multiplicity, right? And this is, it's more, multiplicity for me doesn't have to do with content as much as with structure, right? With allowing for a multiplicity of content. So in a way, for me, there's no reason to choose, right? In a way, you refuse the premise, right? You say, well, local, fine, but how about this? And I say, well, why or rather, I put the question back. Under what circumstances, and this is the Wittgensteinian in me, does it make sense to choose?
Great.
Right? So to me, to make an a priori choice is to commit to something that may not fit a given situation, right? And instead you say, well, give me the circumstance where this matters to you.
Exactly.
Right? What are we talking about?
Exactly.
This situation? Okay, let's see. Right? So that's a way to basically, again, pragmatism, I think, is something that I inherit from there in turning that question around and saying, well, you tell me where the circumstances where this particular issue has purchase.
All right.
Right?
It's an unprocessed mechanism of acting. It's an unprocessed at all times. It's
Exactly.
not something that,
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So again, there's no reason to choose ahead of time. Because also there may be other forms as well, right? I think another thing is that having to have allegiance precludes imagination, right? And says, well, these are the forms in which you must think, right? And who knows, beyond the state, there may be other forms,
Good.
but those will arise through particular contexts.
Good. So to some extent, it's a non-political, non-ideological action. So I'm not trying to depoliticize the action, but to some extent it's not a non-ideological, not previously political. I mean, in the sense that you are assuming a set of values, ideas, dogmatism sometimes, many times, right? And then you add.
Exactly.
It's not the case you are adapting or you are
I was
proposing.
in conversation with someone the other day, and they used a wonderful expression saying, well, do we have to think our way into a new form of living or live our way into a new form of thinking?
Exactly.
And I said, well, why do we have to choose? Those two always work together.
Exactly.
Right? So the theory practice thing, right, is always this living entity. Again, I think thinking is a form of sensibility, right? It's a form of sensing the world. It's not an imposition on the world. And practice without thinking, no please, right? That can be very dangerous.
Good.
So I think living our way and thinking our way can work together.
Yeah.
And the anti-speciesism is very interesting, how to dialogue and reciprocate outside the human. And there, I think, ooh, man, there's so many ways, right? There's so many ways. And for instance, there this amazing biologist, David Gruber, sounds like Graeber, but it's not, it's Gruber with a U, who is doing a project on decoding sperm whale language, okay? Through robotics, artificial intelligence. Basically, it's ChatGPT meets Google Translate applied to whales. Okay, so basically, what they're doing is they're taking advantage of a non-migratory group of sperm whales in the Dominica, and they're installing underwater, basically monitoring of sounds. And then through this software techniques that I don't actually understand, creating a catalog, a dictionary as it were, and trying to find patterns to describe sort of a syntax or to try to tie particular sounds to particular behaviors, etc. And what they're finding, of course, is that it's way more complex than anybody thought, right? Sure. That you need so many data points that it's probably going to take years, etc., etc. But in the meantime, they're also finding out things, right? So that's one way.
Good.
Right? There's lots of other. I think it was Christopher Stone saying that, you know, I know with much more certainty when my lawn needs watering than the Supreme Court judge knows what the United States wants.
Absolutely, sure.
So I think I think we often exaggerate the problem that communication poses.
Yeah.
Right. I think we communicate routinely with
your dogs,
with the environing world. And again, my proposal of restoration is to work on that sensibility. Basically.
Great, thank you.
Digno, 4 questions. A lot of the proposals are dogmatic, you say, right? And how can they then dialogue with an ecocene? In a way, what I think I do by saying, well, they all share this idea of mutual benefit, for instance, or a form of mutualism, a form of ethics, of reciprocity, etc., is to give them a reason why they shouldn't be dogmatic, right? Is to say, well, this is something that you're all doing, okay? And isn't that more important than the bickering about other things, right? That, again, that doesn't mean that now we need the mutualist flag, right? But it's saying, well, let's pay attention to overlaps, right? And to potential alliances that are much more important than deciding ahead of time what matters, right? Whether that's successful or not, I don't know, because dogmatism is a firewall, you know? So, but at least that's my position. You're right that ecological science is not always how I describe it, and I say that as you point out, and also that my proposal is not the same as a parliament of things. So on the one hand, yes, I try to open up what ecological science can be, but not only as a non-expert approach, because I think that expertise is a matter of inheriting a certain practice, right? So expertise is formed. Now we relegate expertise to formal training, okay? But if you take the formal out, okay, expertise is a certain kind of training. In Te Urewera case that you mentioned, Tuhoi community, right, that are now basically have a measure of sovereignty over their ancestral lands. One of the first things they did is to form bush crews, okay? Groups of young Tuhoi members that spend weeks in the bush, in the forest, and then come back and report what they've learned, okay? Now, over time, how is it different from the field ecologist, right? Yeah. And in a way, to show how it's not different, I actually rely more on Isabel Stenger's philosophy of science, right? Where science is a way of questioning, right? It's a way of putting questions to the world such that certain answers become available. Right? And she talks about Galileo's experiment with inclined planes to describe motion, right? That the experimental condition is a way of creating a question that nature can answer in a specific way, right? So in that sense, it's not that anything goes as science, right? It's basically a rigorous process of training, of developing expertise, right? By posing questions that can be sustained over time. And that can be done in experimental ways, but it can also be done in field ways. And that's why I think ecology has a lot of promise. So that I guess is part of my proposal. I think how can we use the law to deal with incommensurability? I think the idea of pluralism, again, is important. And in the other book, Understanding the Rights of Nature, I say at some point that the rights of nature are not about nature, right? And here as well, I think a lot of ecological politics is not about nature, but it's about relationships, multi-species relationships, ecological democracy, and so on and so forth. So there's no guarantee, as you say, you have to be ecological in order to have rights to your territory. There's no guarantee that legal pluralism will do anything that you want as an ecological politics, right? So that's not, the proposal, again, is not motivated by saying, this is where I want to get. It's motivated by saying, this is what we can inherit from a certain way of living in the world that then has implications, right? And the individual, I think that's a really good point. And I agree with Maturana and Varela that the autopoiesis, just like I said with Anthropocene, is a geological concept. I don't think that it has to become wholesale, right? A social and political concept. So I want to distinguish science from norms in some sense, right? And it may be that I don't do that enough in the book. I don't know. But for instance, the idea, should I put it? Norms are different from science, but they're also not uninformed by it, right? And vice versa. There's lots of norms that drive scientific questioning, right? And for instance, for me, the idea of creaturely freedom is something where certain democratic and liberal norms, right, come to be increasingly extended also in ecological science and how we understand creatures to work. And I've done work on the reintroduction of animals, for instance, in Romania as part of rewilding projects. And there, one of the things I found is that animals always do things that you didn't expect or want them to do, right? So they introduce bison to an area in order to do this thing that bison do, and they end up doing something completely different, right? And there, for instance, it's the extension of freedom as a social idea to explaining, right, a process that can be studied scientifically as well. But I completely agree with you that you have to be very careful about sacrificing a norm, right? Because you're fetishizing a certain scientific answer, right? And saying, well, now that it's all mutualism, and by the way, I mean, you can also describe natural processes in parasitic terms, right? What I'm saying is, well, how can these things work together in a way that's interesting, that's fruitful, that gives us other ideas? But your caution there, I think, is extremely welcome. I hope that more or less covers, and we still have time.
Thank you.
¿Alguna dúplica?
No.
So, if there's anyone who has
Thank you so much, and please help me with the pronunciation of your name. Is it Mihnea?
That's better than 90% of people.
Really? So it's a sh. Mihnea.
Yeah, it's like jota in Spanish.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Mihnea, for your presentation. Absolutely excellent. So just a few things. My background is more in analytic legal philosophy, but I've developed an interest in matters that have to do with the importance of place in general. So talking about localities for law. And a question that immediately arose in my mind has to do with the following. I think that even though we usually associate law with deontic concepts like obligation, permission, sometimes freedom, right? I think that the most, let's say, legal of all legal normative concepts is the concept of jurisdiction, right? And jurisdiction has definitely a spatial dimension, among other things, right? And what puzzles me sometimes is that if place, in the sense of locality, where distance that doesn't really matter, because part of the definition of place is something like a topological, thing. So everything is approachable or in proximity with something else. That what makes something local, right? But then jurisdiction seems to try to transcend this dimension of locality. In which sense? Law, by its nature, perhaps, tries to translate everything in terms of domains. A domain is not just a place, it's much more encompassing than the notion of a place. Actually, a domain is something that tries to eliminate the particularities of place in order to normalize some form of regulation. I don't think it's a coincidence or an accident that we talk about the domain of criminal law, for example, right? Or the area of criminal law. So there is a special spatial talk there, but it seems to be a kind of talk that not only is different from talk of place and locality and connection and proximity, but also tries to put pressure on this narrative. So I'm not saying that it is impossible to accommodate place in legal terms. What actually I'm implying is that if that is possible, this is actually a revolutionary step also in regards to how we understand law, in the sense that we should really reconfigure the terms in which we make sense, especially of the concept of jurisdiction, in a way that I can accommodate as literally as possible the dimension of place or the importance of place. Thank you so much.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
I would like to apologize for leaving the class, the floor right now. Yeah. So thanks again for inviting me, for everybody to for attending the conference. Obviously, Mihnea, for
Thank you.
everything. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah,
We'll keep
hablamos.
in contact. Yeah. Hablamos de
Claro.
Gracias.
That's a fantastic point.
I also wanted to recommend you a book. I don't know whether you've seen it. It's called The Fate of Place.
Yes, of course. No,
Amazing. It's
is it
by
Edward Casey? Yeah. I had the pleasure of taking classes with him actually at the New School in New York.
I think this is
Yeah,
amazing.
he's incredible. He's incredible. He just came in, no nose, nothing, with the book under his hands, opened it, and then talked for 2 hours. It was amazing. Anyway, and actually that came to mind, this concept of the spatialization of place, right? And also Doreen Macy comes to mind there. It's an excellent point. I hadn't really considered it in that sense of jurisdiction, and I'll have to think about it. Yeah, I don't know. Thank you for that. I'll have to think about it. Yeah.
This is a novel question.
Again, the idea of pluralism. I know I have colleagues that work on the commons in law and the resurgence of the commons. And part of what I find interesting about their work is how, because there's also levels of jurisdiction, right? And lots of exceptions. And so again, if we go again to the small, one of the colleagues that works on this always says that she's annoyed by how, particularly people of a certain political leaning treat property as the problem, right? And he says, well, and they say property has the usus, fructus, and abusus, right? And the abuse is the problem. And he says, well, you can't burn your house down, even if it's your property, right? To think of property in general as including, the right to destroy is meaningless on a ground level. Because there it depends, right? And it may be the case, for instance, if you have an olive grove in Puglia, in southern Italy, and it has what are called centenary or monumental trees, you cannot touch them so they are your property. On the other hand, you can use herbicides to destroy everything else, right? So that is different from a house in the city, is different from a car, is different. So I'm wondering if then, if you want to in place, right, jurisdiction, one piece, one lead would be to also consider how jurisdiction is already more fragmented than it thinks itself to be. And then the idea of domain would make believe. And where it isn't that fragmented, how would it make sense to fragment it? And for what reason? You know? And that's just an excellent point. I'll take it with me. Thank you. Yeah.
Any questions? ¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿Comentario?
How does this make you feel?
That's a good question, actually. Because it evokes feelings, actually.
Absolutely. It's very based in that. I don't know. Maybe it's like it angers me.
I was very interested about your proposal of the concept lucidity.
Mm.
Mainly because you, if I understood correctly, you suggested that it allows for a combination of the action against these problems and joy and humor.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that, I mean, a more joyful approach might be more motivating, 'cause even if we care about the issues and despair is the only sentiment at one point or another, we're gonna kill ourselves. But the thing is that it seems like the main approach to motivate society has been generating a sense of urgency.
Mm-hmm.
And at least for me, urgency doesn't really seem to go hand in hand with joy, mainly because a sense that we have to do things right now. It doesn't seem to allow space for time to think, time to coordinate ourselves, and time to generate projects that slowly but surely can help to solve these issues. So how does your proposal of lucidity coexist with the sense of urgency, if it can coexist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's no time for joy if it's urgent, right? Thank you. That's a really excellent question. And there's a couple things that come to mind there. This issue of joy, you know, I came to think about it because in education nowadays, and rightly so, environmental problems are very much front and center, if anything, less than they should be, right? So in universities, there's lots of programs in social science, but also in the natural sciences that don't have anything on environmental issues. I think that's a big problem. But what I'm objecting to in terms of hope, despair, and what I'm advocating through lucidity is the freedom of your own future imagination and life, okay? Because when I frame the environmental issues as your future is going to be much shittier, right? I'm imposing on your imagination something that I have been living, right, in a particular kind of way. And I think about this with my daughter quite often, you know, how to be aware without being burdened. Because I think burdening beyond a sense of responsibility can be paralyzing, right? So the idea of joy and humor, besides the fact that I think they're just fundamental attitudes to life that make it worth living, are also ways of realizing that I have no idea how future generations will make a home out of an impoverished world, right? But they must, and they will. And if it's a world worth living, it better have joy, right? Now, the urgency thing, you're absolutely right. And again, my problem with that is not that there's nothing urgent, but it is domination, as you say, the dominant way of motivating, right? And I don't see why it can't sit side by side with other things. And again, Isabel Stengers, which is one of my favorite philosophers, she has this proposal of slowing down thinking, right? And she has a book, it's called A Manifesto for Slow Science. Okay. The English version has a snail on the cover, right? And again, it brings me back to Wanganui, right, and the plan for 50 years. Again, what stepping back from urgency in certain situations allows is the freedom of your own future. Is saying, there is a future. What I do now matters for that future. But A, I don't know exactly how. And whoever comes next is as much an actor as myself, right? And in that sense, slowing down allows for this kind of openness that I think can sit side by side with a rightful sense of urgency, right, for some things. But I don't think that the dominance of that kind of motivation is as constructive as it appears. Yeah.
Okay.
Just one thing, because I was thinking about, I think my voice is quite loud anyway.
No, it's fine. I hear you. I hear you
For
just
the
fine.
people
Right.
online.
Ah, there's people online. I didn't
Yeah.
realize that.
Let me open that again.
Hello, online people.
Oh? Yes,
No.
now. Okay. Coming back to the feeling of hope.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was doing a class on natural rights and the social contract tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the idea there is that, I mean, part of the story of the social contract is that it establishes as the dominant political emotion the emotion of fear.
Mm.
In the sense that, you know, you are afraid of the natural condition, going back to the natural condition. So what is the next best thing? Well, to agree to the terms of subjecting to the authority of Leviathan,
Mm-hmm.
or something similar. And in this regard, it seems like that the notion of hope is the exact, let's say, political counterpart emotion to that of fear.
Mm.
And I think that also connects with the concept of urgency, because urgency also is fear-based.
Mhm.
That there's an imminent danger, right? You should be afraid of what's coming, right? Needless to mention also that this was the definite emotion that perhaps rationally and reasonably governed our responses to the pandemic, for
Mhm.
example, the concept of fear, then the emotion of fear, not the concept of fear. So I think that in this regard also there is this kind of political, not manifesto, but political dimension at the level of emotions that, you know, I think you seem to propose a replacement of something that is much more archaic and, you know,
Mhm.
la raison d'etat, which is fear-based, I mean, in some regards at least. Fear of avoiding sanctions, I mean, law is
Of
also
course.
about that. So, you know, I mean, that I found it also very, very interesting in your presentation.
Yeah, I think that's great to add that. And again, I don't necessarily want to replace anything as challenge the dominance of what exists, right? And to say, and in this, I think some of the most interesting research going on now is on new environmental emotions, right? So for instance, solastalgia is a neologism.
Solastalgia.
Yes. I think it was coined by a philosopher, Albers, I think is the last name. Don't quote me on this, you can look it up. But this feeling of a nostalgia for a lost environmental condition, for instance. Okay? Which is like, oh yeah, I've had that. Whenever it's 25 degrees in February, right? On the one hand, you're like, yoo, beer on the terrace. On the other, you're like, really? Huh. What did I lose, right? So there's new emotions. There's the archaic ones, I completely agree, but there's new ones as well, right? And so I think, again, the repertoire of emotions needs to be foregrounded. There's, for instance, the philosopher Simon Critchley talks about anger as the most political of emotions.
That's the worst one, actually.
Right? But right, or I have a colleague who works on environmental emotions, and she talks about indignation. Right, in Spain, you should know about that.
We have a lot of
Right?
these days.
It's a form, exactly. It's a form of anger. It's a, you know, there. She does on Spinoza, for instance, when she talks about indignation, and so that's where I want to be, right, in that discussion, as opposed to should I be hopeful or should I despair, right, or should I just fear? I think, yeah, there again, it's silly to throw something out as entirely irrelevant, but the question is, where is it relevant, for who, under which conditions, and isn't it better to have a toolbox?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Tănăsescu. It has been
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. Muchísimas gracias. Y damos por terminada la sesión. Muchas gracias por su participación. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you.